When the mountain avalanche roared down like the breath of an angry god, Dr. Savannah Mackenzie thought her life was over. Instead, she found herself buried alive in an abandoned wolf's den, fighting hypothermia and despair in absolute darkness. What she couldn't know was that 50 miles away, Marcus Chitto, a Choctaw hunter whose grandfather had taught him to read the whispers of the earth, was already following signs that would lead him on the most impossible rescue of his life. This is a story about the thin line between death and survival, about ancient wisdom meeting modern catastrophe, and how two souls from different worlds discovered they were connected by something deeper than chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Cascade Mountains of Washington State had been Dr. Savannah Mackenzie's sanctuary for 8 years, ever since her messy divorce had left her questioning everything she thought she knew about trust, love, and human connection. At 31, Savannah was a wildlife veterinarian who specialized in large predator rehabilitation, spending more time treating injured bears and mountain lions than she did in human company. Her colleagues at the Pacific Northwest Wildlife Center often joked that she preferred 4-legged patients to 2-legged ones, and they weren't entirely wrong. Savannah's small cabin outside the town of Cascade Falls had become her fortress of solitude. No neighbors within 2 miles, no cell phone coverage, no unexpected visitors dropping by with casseroles and unsolicited advice about her love life. Just the mountains, the forest, and the occasional injured animal that needed her expertise. It was exactly the kind of isolation that had once terrified her, back when she was married to David, a cardiac surgeon who believed that success was measured by the number of people who knew your name. Now, anonymity felt like freedom. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone who spent her professional life saving predators had become something of a predator herself, hunting solitude with the same intensity that wolves hunt elk. But after 18 months of David's affairs, lies, and the final humiliation of discovering he'd been sleeping with his surgical nurse in the very hospital where Savannah had once volunteered, she'd learned that humans were far more dangerous than any wild animal she'd ever treated. At least when a bear was angry, it didn't pretend to love you first. March in the Cascades was a treacherous time for backcountry travel. The snowpack was deep and unstable, warming days followed by freezing nights, creating layers of ice and powder that could slide without warning. Savannah knew the risks better than most. She'd spent countless hours in these mountains, tracking radio-collared wolves for population studies, following migration patterns, and occasionally darting aggressive animals that had wandered too close to human settlements. She understood avalanche conditions, carried proper safety equipment, and never traveled alone during high-risk periods. Except this time, she did. The call had come at 5 in the morning from Jake Morrison, a local rancher whose property bordered the national forest. One of his prize heifers had been attacked by what appeared to be a lone wolf, and the animal was badly injured but still alive. Jake was offering $5,000 for someone to track and tranquilize the wolf before it became a bigger problem. It was exactly the kind of situation where delay meant death, either for the livestock or the predator. Savannah should have waited for her usual tracking partner, Ben Clearwater, a retired forest ranger who knew these mountains like his own backyard. But Ben was visiting his daughter in Seattle and wouldn't be back for 3 days. She should have contacted the state wildlife department and let them handle it. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time official help arrived, the injured wolf would likely be dead from its wounds or put down by angry ranchers. Instead, Savannah loaded her tranquilizer rifle, survival gear, and emergency supplies into her modified Jeep Wrangler and headed into the mountains alone. She told herself it was just a day trip, a simple track and dart operation that she'd performed dozens of times before. The weather forecast showed clear skies and moderate temperatures. The avalanche danger was rated as considerable, not extreme. She would be careful, stay on established trails, and avoid the steeper slopes where slides were most likely. Every experienced mountaineer knows that avalanches don't care about your experience, your equipment, or your good intentions. They are triggered by a combination of factors so complex that even experts with decades of training can be caught off guard. Temperature, wind, recent snowfall, slope angle, and simple bad luck combine in ways that turn peaceful mountainsides into killing machines with no warning. Savannah found the wolf's tracks 3 hours into her hike, following a game trail that wound through stands of old-growth Douglas fir and hemlock. The prints told a story of an animal in distress. The stride was uneven, suggesting injury, and there were occasional drops of blood frozen in the snow. The wolf was heading higher into the mountains, probably seeking the security of familiar denning areas where it could rest and recover. The trail led Savannah into increasingly steep terrain. She was an experienced hiker, comfortable with technical scrambling and snow travel, but she began to feel uneasy as the slope angles increased. The snow beneath her feet had a hollow sound that suggested instability. Wind patterns had created slabs of wind-loaded snow that could fracture and slide under the right conditions. Savannah paused to check her avalanche transceiver, making sure the device was functioning and that her probe and shovel were easily accessible. She considered turning back, but the wolf tracks were fresh, probably no more than a few hours old. The injured animal was close, and if she could dart it today, she could prevent what might otherwise become a tragic confrontation between predator and rancher. The decision to continue up the slope would haunt Savannah for the rest of her life, though at the time it seemed entirely reasonable. She was following established game trails. The weather was clear and she had extensive mountain experience. She was also carrying a satellite emergency beacon that would summon help if anything went wrong. What she didn't know was that 2 days of unseasonably warm weather had created a perfect storm of avalanche conditions. Wind had loaded snow onto north-facing slopes, creating dense slabs sitting on top of weaker layers. Temperature fluctuations had created a lubricating layer of ice that was just waiting for the right trigger. The wolf tracks led to a natural amphitheater surrounded by steep walls, exactly the kind of terrain where predators often established denning sites. Savannah could see disturbed snow at the base of a rock outcropping, suggesting the animal had stopped to rest. She was perhaps 100 yards away when she spotted movement among the trees. The wolf was magnificent, even in its injured state. A large male, probably the alpha from one of the local packs, with thick grey fur and intelligent amber eyes that met hers across the distance. Savannah could see the wounds on its shoulder and flank, consistent with defensive injuries from protecting livestock. The animal wasn't aggressive, just exhausted and hurt. Savannah raised her tranquilizer rifle, calculating distance and wind conditions. She had one shot to do this right. If she missed, the wolf would bolt deeper into the mountains and she might never find it again. If the dart didn't deliver the right dose, she could either fail to immobilize the animal or accidentally kill it with an overdose. She was adjusting her scope when the mountain moved. The avalanche started as a subtle shift in the snow above her, a barely perceptible crack that propagated across the slope like lightning. Savannah heard it before she saw it, a deep whoomph sound that experienced mountaineers learn to fear above all others. She looked up to see a wall of white death bearing down on her at 40 miles per hour. Training took over. Savannah dropped her rifle and tried to ski out of the slide path, angling toward the edge where the avalanche energy would be lowest. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. But she was in the middle of the starting zone, and there was nowhere to run. The snow hit her like a freight train, instantly burying her in a tumbling chaos of ice and debris. Avalanche survival training teaches you to fight for the surface, to swim upward through the moving snow, to try to create an air pocket around your face before the slide stops and the snow sets like concrete. Savannah did everything right, but the slide was massive, carrying her down the mountain like a leaf in a hurricane. She had no idea how long the ride lasted. Time became meaningless. In the thundering white chaos, trees, rocks, and chunks of ice tumbled past her as the avalanche scoured the mountainside clean. Savannah fought to stay oriented, to keep her head above the surface, but the forces involved were beyond human resistance. When the snow finally stopped moving, Savannah found herself in complete darkness, buried under what felt like tons of concrete-hard snow. She was alive, which seemed impossible, but she couldn't move her arms or legs. Panic began to set in as she realized she was completely entombed, with no way to dig herself out and no one who knew where she was. The air pocket around her face was tiny, maybe the size of a coffee cup. She could breathe, but barely, and she knew that the carbon dioxide from her exhalations would quickly poison the small space. She had perhaps 30 minutes before she would lose consciousness, maybe an hour before she died from suffocation. Savannah forced herself to remain calm, to think clearly about her situation. She was buried alive, but she was in some kind of hollow space. As her eyes adjusted to the absolute darkness, she began to understand where the avalanche had deposited her. The debris flow had carried her into what appeared to be a natural cave or overhang, and the snow had formed a partial roof over the opening instead of filling it completely. She wasn't just buried in the avalanche. She was trapped in what looked like an abandoned animal den. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead it filled Savannah with hope. If this was a den, it might have multiple openings. Animals didn't create shelters with only one way in and out. There might be an escape route if she could find it in the darkness. Savannah began exploring her prison by feel, running her hands along the walls and ceiling. The space was larger than she'd first thought, perhaps 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, with a ceiling that varied from 2 to 5 feet high. The floor was covered with what felt like old leaves, animal fur, and the distinctive smell of predator musk. She was definitely in a wolf den, probably the same denning complex where the injured male had been heading. The irony was overwhelming. She'd come into the mountains to save a wolf, and now she was trapped in its home, hoping that same den might save her life. As Savannah explored the den more thoroughly, she made a discovery that changed everything. At the back of the chamber, behind a pile of what felt like old bones and cached prey, there was a current of air, cold air moving from somewhere outside the den system. There was another way out. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and it led downward into complete darkness. Savannah had no idea where it went or whether it would lead to safety or just another dead end, but staying in the main chamber meant certain death. The air pocket was already growing stale, and she could feel the beginnings of carbon dioxide poisoning making her thoughts fuzzy. Savannah began crawling through the narrow passage, feeling her way forward, inch by inch. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through what she assumed was a natural cave system. Her knees and elbows were scraped raw from the rough stone, and claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Savannah saw it. A faint glimmer of grey light ahead, so dim she almost convinced herself it was hallucination. But as she crawled closer, the light grew stronger. There was an opening, a way out of the underground maze. Savannah emerged from the cave system into what appeared to be a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. Snow was falling lightly, and the temperature was well below freezing. But after the claustrophobic terror of the buried den, the open air felt like paradise. She was alive, free, and back on the surface. But as Savannah took stock of her situation, she realized that survival was far from guaranteed. The avalanche had swept away all of her equipment. No pack, no emergency supplies, no satellite beacon, no way to signal for help. She was wearing only her hiking clothes, which were already soaked through from crawling through the cave system. Worse, she had no idea where she was. The avalanche had carried her far from her original location, and the cave system had disoriented her completely. She was lost in one of the most remote wilderness areas in Washington state, with a major storm system moving in and temperatures dropping toward levels that would kill an unprepared person in hours. Savannah looked around the small clearing, trying to orient herself and develop a survival plan. The trees were primarily old-growth fir and hemlock, suggesting she was still at relatively high elevation. The snow was deep, probably 4 to 5 feet, which would make travel difficult without snowshoes. And the weather was deteriorating rapidly, with increasing wind and heavier snowfall that would make navigation impossible. She needed shelter, warmth, and a way to signal for help. The cave system she'd emerged from might provide protection from the wind, but it would also be a death trap if temperatures dropped too low. Hypothermia was already a concern. Her wet clothes were stealing body heat, and she could feel the early stages of cold injury in her fingers and toes. As Savannah searched the clearing for anything that might help her survive, she noticed something that made her heart race with hope. At the edge of the tree line, nearly hidden by snow and shadow, were boot prints, human tracks recent enough that they hadn't been completely filled by the falling snow. Someone else was in these mountains, someone who might be able to help her, or at least point her towards safety. Savannah began following the tracks, moving as quickly as her injured body would allow through the deepening snow. The trail led through dense forest, winding between massive trees and over fallen logs, buried under snow. Whoever had made these tracks was an experienced mountaineer, choosing routes that minimized energy expenditure and avalanche risk. The stride pattern suggested someone tall and strong, moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from a lifetime of wilderness travel. After following the tracks for nearly an hour, Savannah began to hear something that seemed impossible in this remote wilderness. Singing, a low, rhythmic chant in a language she didn't recognize, carried on the wind like a prayer or incantation. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of her on the trail. Savannah increased her pace, fighting through snow that was now knee-deep and falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to just a few yards. The singing grew louder, more distinct, and she could make out what sounded like traditional Native American vocals, rich with harmonics and spiritual power. Then, through the falling snow and gathering darkness, Savannah saw him. The man was tall and powerfully built, probably in his 40s, with long black hair and features that spoke of Native American heritage. He was dressed in traditional hunting gear, mixed with modern winter clothing, and he moved through the deep snow with an effortless grace that suggested intimate familiarity with this terrain. At his side walked a large dog, some kind of husky or Malamute mix that seemed as comfortable in the wilderness as its human companion. The man stopped singing when he spotted Savannah stumbling through the snow toward him. For a moment, they stared at each other across the white landscape, two people who seemed to belong to completely different worlds, brought together by circumstances that defied explanation. "Help!" Savannah managed to say, her voice barely audible. "Over the wind. Please, I was caught in an avalanche. I'm lost." The man's expression immediately shifted from surprise to concern. He approached her with quick, sure steps, his trained eye taking in her condition, her wet clothes, and the obvious signs of hypothermia that were already setting in. "My name is Marcus Chitto," he said, his voice deep and calming. "I'm going to help you. But first, we need to get you warm before you freeze to death." Marcus moved, with the kind of efficient competence that comes from a lifetime of emergency situations. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from his pack and wrapped it around Savannah's shoulders, then produced a thermos of hot tea that tasted like salvation. "Drink this slowly," he instructed. "Your body temperature is dangerously low. We need to warm you up gradually." As feeling began to return to Savannah's extremities, she found herself studying her rescuer more closely. Marcus Choctaw had the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that moved with practiced skill. Everything about him suggested competence, from the way he organized his equipment to the calm authority in his voice. "How did you find me?" Savannah asked when she could speak without her teeth chattering. Marcus glanced at his dog, who was sitting alertly nearby, then looked back at Savannah with something that might have been a smile. "Tracker didn't find you," he said. "I was following. Sign from that avalanche, looking for survivors. My grandfather taught me that mountains speak to those who know how to listen. Today, they told me someone was fighting for their life up here." As Marcus continued treating Savannah for hypothermia and exposure, she began to understand that her rescue was far from over. They were still in the middle of a vast wilderness, with a major storm system moving in and darkness falling fast. But for the first time since the avalanche had swept her down the mountain, Savannah felt like she might actually survive this ordeal. The man who had found her wasn't just an experienced outdoorsman. He was someone who understood these mountains in a way that went beyond maps and GPS devices. Someone whose knowledge had been passed down through generations of people who had lived in harmony with this harsh and beautiful landscape. Marcus Choctaw had found her against impossible odds, guided by traditional skills and intuition that connected him to the land in ways Savannah was only beginning to understand. Now, as snow continued to fall and temperatures dropped toward deadly levels, she would have to trust her life to a stranger whose world was completely different from her own. But as Marcus efficiently prepared a shelter and continued treating her injuries, Savannah realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. Something profound had happened when their paths crossed in the wilderness, something that went deeper than simple rescue. They were two people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different ways of understanding the world, but they had been brought together by forces that neither of them fully comprehended. The avalanche had taken everything from Savannah, stripping away her equipment, her plans, and her illusions of self-sufficiency. But in return, it had given her something unexpected, a chance to see the world through the eyes of someone whose connection to the land was ancient, spiritual, and utterly authentic. As night fell over the mountains and Marcus worked to keep them both alive, Savannah found herself wondering if this was how all the most important meetings happened, not through careful planning or social introduction, but through the kind of extraordinary circumstances that revealed who people really were when everything else was stripped away. The wolf den that had sheltered her, the tracks that had led her to Marcus, the traditional knowledge that had guided him to her location. It all seemed to be part of something larger than coincidence, something that connected them to the ancient rhythms of predator and prey, survival and salvation that had played out in these mountains for thousands of years. Marcus Choctaw had been following the old ways since he was 7 years old, when his grandfather, Joseph Choctaw, first took him into the Cascade Mountains to learn what couldn't be taught in books or classrooms. Now, at 43, Marcus understood that traditional knowledge wasn't just about survival techniques or hunting skills. It was about reading the world as a living story, where every broken branch, every unusual bird call, and every shift in the wind carried meaning for those who knew how to listen. The avalanche that had swept Savannah Mackenzie down the mountain had been felt 50 miles away at Marcus's cabin near the Chehalis River, where he worked as a traditional craftsman and cultural educator for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma's Pacific Northwest Outreach Program. The tremor that preceded the slide had woken him from deep sleep at 3:17 a.m., not because of its physical intensity, but because something about it felt wrong in ways his grandfather had taught him to recognize. Joseph Choctaw had been a medicine man and tracker who bridged two worlds. He'd served as a code talker in World War II, using the Choctaw language to transmit military secrets that the enemy couldn't decode, then returned home to find that the traditional ways he'd been raised with were disappearing as young people moved to cities and forgot the old knowledge. Joseph had spent the last 40 years of his life teaching anyone who would listen, but few had the patience or spiritual commitment to truly understand what he was offering. Marcus had been different. From childhood, he'd shown an intuitive connection to the natural world that reminded Joseph of the old stories, the legends of people who could speak with animals and read the future in cloud patterns. When Marcus was 12, he'd successfully tracked a missing child through dense forest by following sign that experienced searchers had missed. By 18, he could predict weather changes days in advance by observing subtle shifts in animal behavior and atmospheric pressure. But traditional skills weren't enough to make a living in the modern world. Marcus had earned a degree in forestry from the University of Washington, worked for 10 years as a wilderness guide and search and rescue coordinator, then eventually found his calling as a cultural preservationist. He carved traditional tools, taught ancient hunting techniques, and served as a consultant for archaeologists and ethnographers studying Pacific Northwest indigenous cultures. The work was fulfilling, but isolating. Most people saw traditional knowledge as historical curiosity rather than living wisdom. They wanted to learn about Native American culture for academic credit or tourist entertainment, not because they understood that indigenous ways of knowing offered practical solutions to modern problems. Marcus had grown used to being treated as a living museum exhibit, a repository of quaint customs, rather than a practitioner of sophisticated survival science. That morning, as Marcus sat in his workshop carving a traditional Choctaw bow from wood, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening in the mountains. The avalanche tremor had been followed by unusual weather patterns, wind directions that didn't match the forecast, bird migrations that seemed disrupted. His dog, Tracker, a wolf-husky mix he'd rescued as a puppy, had been restless and anxious since dawn, pacing the cabin and whining at the door. Tracker wasn't just a pet. The dog had been trained using traditional methods that Marcus's grandfather had learned from Inuit hunters during his military service in Alaska. The animal could follow scent trails over incredible distances, detect weather changes hours before modern instruments, and sense human presence from miles away. When Tracker was agitated, Marcus paid attention. By noon, Marcus had made the decision to investigate. He loaded his truck with winter survival gear, emergency medical supplies, and the kind of equipment that most people didn't know existed outside of military special operations. Rope systems designed for technical rescue, Avalanche, probes and transceivers, traditional snowshoes carved from ash and sinew, modern GPS devices alongside hand-drawn maps that showed landmarks and trail systems passed down through generations of indigenous hunters. The drive into the Cascades took 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. Marcus knew every logging trail, every seasonal bridge, and every potential hazard in this part of the mountain range. His grandfather had hunted these ridges for elk and bear and had taught Marcus to read the landscape as a three-dimensional map of opportunities and dangers. As Marcus drove higher into the mountains, Tracker's agitation increased. The dog pressed his nose against the truck window, sniffing air currents that carried information invisible to human senses. When they reached the end of the maintained road system, still 20 miles from where the avalanche had occurred, Tracker began vocalizing in the low, urgent whine that meant he'd detected human scent. Marcus parked the truck and began preparing for what might be a multi-day search operation. He'd participated in dozens of wilderness rescues over the years and had learned that success often depended more on traditional tracking skills than on modern technology. Helicopters couldn't fly in bad weather, GPS devices failed when batteries died, or satellites were blocked by terrain. But a skilled tracker could follow sign that was days old, could predict where a lost person might seek shelter, and could navigate by stars and landmarks when all else failed. The first sign Marcus found was Savannah's Jeep, abandoned at a trailhead that most recreational hikers never discovered. The vehicle told him several important things. The driver was experienced enough to know about remote access points. They'd come prepared for winter conditions based on the gear visible through the windows, and they'd been gone long enough for snow to accumulate on the windshield, suggesting at least 12 hours since departure. Marcus circled the vehicle carefully, reading the story written in tracks and disturbed snow. Boot prints leading toward the high country, the distinctive pattern of someone carrying a heavy pack, no return tracks, which meant the person was either still in the mountains or had left by a different route. But there was something else. Tracker had found a scent trail that excited him more than normal human tracks would. The dog was trained to differentiate between recreational hikers and people in distress, and his behavior suggested that whoever had left this jeep was in serious trouble. Marcus began following the trail, moving at the steady pace that his grandfather had taught him. Not too fast, which would cause him to miss subtle sign or exhaust himself. Not too slow, which might mean arriving too late to help. Just the right rhythm to cover ground efficiently while staying alert to everything the landscape was telling him. The tracks led through terrain that Marcus knew intimately. Game trails that elk used during migration, winter feeding areas where deer concentrated when snow covered their normal browse, natural shelter sites where experienced outdoors people might wait out bad weather. As he followed the trail higher, into the mountains, Marcus began to understand that whoever he was tracking had considerable wilderness experience. But experience wasn't always enough. The mountains demanded humility from even the most skilled travelers, and conditions this week had been particularly treacherous. Unseasonably warm weather followed by rapid cooling had created perfect avalanche conditions. Marcus had been monitoring the snowpack instability reports and had decided against his own planned hunting trip because the risks were too high. 3 hours into his tracking, Marcus found the avalanche site. The scope of the slide was massive, involving hundreds of thousands of tons of snow and debris that had scoured a quarter-mile-wide path down the mountainside. Trees had been snapped off at ground level. Boulders the size of houses had been moved. Like pebbles, it was the kind of natural disaster that typically left no survivors. Marcus studied the avalanche debris field with growing concern. Most people caught in slides this large were found dead, if they were found at all. The forces involved were beyond human endurance. But Tracker was still following scent, still, indicating that their quarry had somehow survived the initial impact. Traditional tracking required patience and systematic observation. Marcus began working the edges of the debris field, looking for sign that someone had been thrown clear of the main flow. Tracker quartered back and forth across the avalanche path, his nose processing information that no human could detect. It was the dog who found the first clue. At the base of a rock outcropping, partially buried under avalanche debris, Tracker alerted to what appeared to be a disturbed area in the snow. Marcus began carefully excavating, using his hands and traditional snow tools to avoid damaging whatever might be buried underneath. What he found made him reassess everything he thought he knew about the situation. Scattered in the snow were pieces of scientific equipment, a broken GPS device, fragments of what looked like a tranquilizer rifle, field notebooks in waterproof cases. This wasn't a recreational hiker who'd been caught by bad luck. This was someone who'd been in the mountains on official business, probably a wildlife researcher or veterinarian. The equipment told Marcus that he was dealing with a professional, someone with training and experience who would know how to maximize their survival chances. But it also meant that person was alone, without the kind of support team that usually accompanied scientific expeditions. Alone, and caught in an avalanche, meant that time was running out fast. Marcus expanded his search pattern using traditional techniques that his grandfather had learned from Siberian reindeer herders during cultural exchanges in the 1960s. The method involved reading micro-terrain features that might channel avalanche debris in unexpected directions, natural wind patterns that could create survival pockets, rock formations that might deflect flowing snow. It was during this systematic search that Marcus made the discovery that changed everything. In a small clearing nearly half a mile from the main avalanche path, tracker alerted to human scent again, but this time the sign was different, fresher, more recent. Someone had been in this area within the last few hours. Marcus studied the clearing carefully, noting details that most people would never see. Disturbed snow around what appeared to be a natural cave opening, the distinctive pattern of someone crawling or climbing rather than walking, and most significantly, tracks leading away from the cave system toward the dense forest beyond. The cave opening was partially concealed by fallen logs and accumulated snow, but Marcus could see that it had been recently used. Fresh scratches in the stone, disturbed debris around the entrance, and when he knelt down and listened carefully, he could hear something that made his heart race, the faint echo of moving air, suggesting a complex underground system. This wasn't just a cave. It was part of the natural den complex that local wolf packs used for winter shelter. Marcus knew these systems existed throughout the Cascades, carved by centuries of geological activity and enlarged by generations of denning animals. If someone had taken shelter in the den network, they might have survived the avalanche, only to become lost in underground passages that could extend for miles. Marcus made a decision that went against every modern search and rescue protocol. Instead of calling for official help, he chose to continue tracking alone. Helicopter rescues were impossible in current weather conditions. Ground teams would take hours to organize and deploy, and traditional knowledge suggested that whoever he was following was moving, trying to navigate their way out of a desperate situation. He began following the tracks away from the cave system, noting that the person was moving with purpose rather than wandering randomly. The stride pattern suggested someone injured but mobile, possibly suffering from hypothermia, but still thinking clearly enough to choose efficient routes through difficult terrain. Tracker was increasingly excited, his behavior indicating that they were getting closer to their target. The dog's training allowed him to differentiate between old and fresh scent, and everything about his body language suggested that the person they were following was nearby. As afternoon faded toward evening and snow began falling more heavily, Marcus heard something that confirmed what Tracker had been telling him, a human voice, faint but unmistakable, calling for help somewhere ahead of them on the trail. Marcus increased his pace, moving through the deepening snow with the efficient stride that his grandfather had taught him. But as he got closer to the voice, he realized that this rescue was going to be more complicated than a simple search and find operation. The person he was tracking wasn't just lost and injured. They were in the advanced stages of hypothermia, moving through wilderness terrain in conditions that would kill an unprepared person within hours. And with a major storm system moving in, Marcus had perhaps one chance to reach them before weather made rescue impossible. When Marcus finally spotted the figure stumbling through the snow ahead of him, he understood immediately that he was looking at someone on the edge of death. The woman's movements were uncoordinated, her clothing inadequate for current conditions, and her speech slurred from cold and exhaustion. But even in her desperate condition, Marcus could see that she was a fighter. She'd survived an avalanche, escaped from an underground cave system, and navigated miles of wilderness terrain without proper equipment. This was someone with both knowledge and determination, qualities that Marcus respected regardless of her cultural background. As Marcus approached the struggling woman, he began singing the traditional rescue song that his grandfather had taught him, a Choctaw chant that was supposed to call lost spirits back to the world of the living. He didn't know if she would understand the cultural significance, but the rhythm and tone would carry reassurance across any language barrier. When their eyes met across the snowy landscape, Marcus saw something that told him this rescue was going to be different from any he'd attempted before. This wasn't just about saving someone's life. This was about building a bridge between two worlds that rarely intersected, about finding common ground between modern scientific knowledge and ancient wisdom. The woman he'd tracked through impossible terrain was Dr. Savannah Mackenzie, though Marcus wouldn't learn her name for several more hours. What he saw was someone who'd been transformed by survival, stripped down to essential qualities that transcended profession, education, or cultural background. She was simply a human being fighting to live, depending on the kindness of a stranger, whose world was completely different from her own. Marcus moved quickly to begin treating her hypothermia, drawing on medical training that combined modern first aid with traditional healing practices. But as he worked to stabilize her condition, he realized that getting Savannah warm and conscious was only the beginning of their challenges. They were still in the middle of a vast wilderness, with a major storm moving in and temperatures dropping, toward levels that would test even Marcus's extensive survival skills. The nearest road was hours away by foot, and the terrain between their current position and safety included several technical sections that would be extremely dangerous for someone in Savannah's condition. But Marcus had advantages that most rescuers lacked. His knowledge of these mountains included traditional routes and shelter sites that didn't appear on modern maps. His equipment combined the best of contemporary survival technology with traditional tools that had been tested by generations of indigenous hunters, and his understanding of wilderness psychology included techniques for maintaining morale and decision-making capacity under extreme stress. As night fell and snow continued to accumulate, Marcus began implementing a survival strategy that would keep them both alive until conditions improved enough for evacuation. It would require trust, cooperation, and a willingness to set aside cultural differences in favor of practical necessity. The Choctaw tracker and the wildlife veterinarian were about to begin an intensive crash course in survival, cooperation, and the kind of deep human connection that only emerges when everything else is stripped away by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The emergency shelter that Marcus Choctaw constructed in the deepening wilderness storm was unlike anything Savannah Mackenzie had ever seen. Working with swift precision as snow fell harder and wind howled through the trees, Marcus combined traditional Choctaw survival techniques with modern materials to create a shelter that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Within an hour, what had been an exposed clearing became a warm, dry sanctuary that felt more secure than many permanent buildings. Marcus had chosen the location with the kind of strategic thinking that came from generations of accumulated wisdom. The site was protected from prevailing winds by a natural rock formation, positioned to take advantage of radiant heat from stones that had absorbed solar energy during the day, and situated near a small creek that provided fresh water without the risk of flash flooding. Most importantly, it was invisible from a distance, camouflaged in ways that would protect them from both the elements and any potentially dangerous wildlife. The shelter itself was a masterpiece of engineering that required no nails, screws, or modern fasteners. Marcus used a framework of flexible saplings, bent into precise curves and lashed together with cordage he'd made from inner bark fiber. The covering combined a modern tarp with layers of pine boughs arranged in overlapping patterns that shed water while providing insulation. Inside, he'd created a raised sleeping platform using techniques that kept them off the frozen ground while reflecting body heat back upward. But the most impressive element was the heating system. Marcus had constructed what he called a shepherd's fire, a carefully engineered arrangement of logs and stones that would burn efficiently throughout the night while requiring minimal maintenance. The design channeled heat into the shelter, while directing smoke away from the sleeping area, creating a warm microclimate that felt tropical compared to the sub-zero conditions outside. As Savannah recovered from her hypothermia ordeal, wrapped in Marcus's spare sleeping bag and slowly sipping hot tea brewed from wild plants he'd identified and gathered, she found herself studying her rescuer with growing fascination. Marcus Chito was clearly much more than an experienced outdoorsman. His knowledge seemed to encompass botany, geology, meteorology, engineering, and medicine, all integrated into a seamless understanding of how to work with natural systems rather than against them. "How did you learn all this?" Savannah asked, gesturing toward the shelter that was keeping them alive. Marcus was carving something from a piece of wood, his hands moving with the kind of automatic precision that suggested decades of practice. "My grandfather started teaching me when I was 7. Said the old ways weren't just history, they were survival tools that people might need again someday." Guess he was right. The carving taking shape under Marcus's knife was a small whistle. But as Savannah watched him work, she realized it wasn't just a simple noisemaker. The proportions and angles were precisely calculated to produce specific tones that would carry over long distances in mountain terrain. It was a communication device designed for exactly the kind of emergency they were currently experiencing. "Are you making that to signal for help?" Savannah asked. Marcus paused in his carving to meet her eyes. Traditional rescue operations aren't just about finding people. They're about helping people find each other. Sound travels differently in mountains than it does on flat ground. This whistle is tuned to frequencies that echo off rock formations in patterns that trained listeners can interpret. As Marcus explained the acoustic principles behind traditional signaling methods, Savannah began to understand that she was receiving an education in survival science that most people never encountered. Indigenous knowledge wasn't primitive or outdated. It was sophisticated technology developed and refined over thousands of years by people whose lives depended on understanding natural systems with absolute precision. The storm outside intensified as evening progressed, but inside, their shelter, Savannah felt safer than she had since before the avalanche. Marcus maintained the fire with movements so efficient they seemed choreographed, adding fuel and adjusting airflow with barely a glance at what he was doing. His attention was focused on constantly monitoring their environment, listening to wind patterns, checking the structural integrity of their shelter, and observing Tracker's behavior for signs of changing conditions. Tracker, the wolf-husky mix who had led Marcus to Savannah's location, was proving to be as remarkable as his owner. The dog positioned himself at the shelter entrance, serving as an early warning system for weather changes, wildlife activity, and any other potential threats. But unlike a guard dog that relied primarily on aggression, Tracker seemed to function as a sophisticated sensor array, processing information from multiple sources and communicating his findings through subtle changes in posture and behavior. "He's not just a pet, is he?" Savannah observed, watching the way Marcus and Tracker communicated, through almost telepathic understanding. "Tracker is my partner," Marcus replied, "trained using methods my grandfather learned from Inuit hunters. In traditional cultures, the relationship between humans and working animals isn't about dominance, it's about cooperation. Tracker knows these mountains as well as I do, sometimes better. He found you when conventional search methods would have failed." As the night progressed, Savannah and Marcus settled into the kind of conversation that only happens when people are thrown together by extraordinary circumstances. Without the normal social barriers of professional identity, cultural background, or economic status, they began sharing stories and perspectives with unusual honesty. Savannah talked about her work as a wildlife veterinarian, describing the challenges of treating injured predators in a world where human development increasingly encroached on natural habitats. She explained how her divorce had driven her to seek solitude in the mountains, and how her expertise with large carnivores had led to the tracking mission that had nearly cost her life. Marcus listened with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite social interaction. When Savannah described her frustration with bureaucratic obstacles to wildlife conservation, he nodded with understanding that came from his own experience navigating cultural preservation efforts within institutional systems that didn't always value traditional knowledge. Modern conservation tries to protect nature by separating it from human activity, Marcus said. Traditional approaches recognize that humans are part of natural systems. The goal isn't to keep people away from wilderness, it's to help people live in harmony with the land. The philosophical difference was profound, and it led to a discussion that lasted for hours. Savannah's scientific training had taught her to think in terms of quantifiable data, controlled variables, and peer-reviewed research. Marcus's education had emphasized observation, intuition, and knowledge that was tested through practical application across generations. But as they talked, both began to recognize that their different approaches to understanding the natural world were complementary rather than contradictory. Savannah's medical training gave her insights into animal physiology and behavior that could enhance traditional hunting and tracking techniques. Marcus's knowledge of ecological relationships and seasonal patterns could inform scientific research in ways that laboratory studies couldn't match. The conversation was interrupted by a change in Tracker's behavior that immediately got Marcus's attention. The dog rose from his position at the shelter entrance, ears alert and body tense, in a way that suggested he'd detected something significant. "What is it?" Savannah whispered. Marcus held up a hand for silence, listening to sounds that Savannah couldn't identify. After several minutes he relaxed slightly, but remained alert. "Wolves," he said quietly. "A pack, probably hunting. They're not close enough to be dangerous, but Tracker can hear them communicating." The realization that they were sharing the mountain with a wolf pack should have been terrifying, especially given Savannah's recent experience of being trapped in a wolf den. Instead, she found herself fascinated by the idea of observing wild wolves in their natural habitat. "Are they the same pack that uses the den where I was trapped?" she asked. Marcus considered the question, processing information from wind direction, Tracker's body language, and his own knowledge of local wolf territories. "Probably. Winter hunting patterns are predictable if you understand prey movements and denning locations. The pack is likely following elk herds down from higher elevations." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of wolf howls began echoing across the mountain landscape. The vocalizations were hauntingly beautiful, a complex harmony that seemed to capture something essential about wilderness that couldn't be expressed in human language. Savannah listened with professional interest, recognizing some of the communication patterns she'd studied in her veterinary training. But hearing the wolves in their natural environment, while sheltering in a traditional structure built using knowledge that predated modern civilization, gave her a perspective on predator behavior that no textbook could provide. They're not just hunting, she realized. They're coordinating a complex social activity across a large territory. Marcus smiled, appreciating her insight. Traditional hunters understood that wolves weren't just predators, they were teachers. Watching wolf packs taught indigenous people about cooperation, communication, and strategic thinking. The wolf chorus continued for nearly an hour, with different pack members contributing to a conversation that covered miles of mountainous terrain. Marcus translated some of what he was hearing, explaining how different types of howls conveyed information about location, prey movements, and pack hierarchy. My grandfather could identify individual wolves by their voices, Marcus said. He knew the genealogy of local packs going back decades, understood their territorial boundaries and seasonal movement patterns. That knowledge helped him predict where other game animals would be found, because predator and prey populations are always connected. As the wolf sounds faded into the distance, Savannah found herself thinking about the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment. The injured wolf she'd been tracking when the avalanche hit, the abandoned den that had sheltered her from suffocation, the traditional knowledge that had guided Marcus to her location. It all seemed to be part of a larger pattern that connected. Predator and prey, survival and salvation, ancient wisdom and modern emergency. Do you think it's just coincidence? She asked Marcus. All of this, the avalanche, the den, you finding me? Marcus was quiet for a long time, feeding the fire and considering her question with the kind of thoughtfulness that suggested it touched on something fundamental to his worldview. Traditional cultures don't really have a concept of coincidence, he finally said. Everything is connected. People, animals, land, weather, spiritual forces. What looks like random chance to modern thinking is usually part of larger patterns that become visible when you learn how to see them. The philosophical conversation continued through the night, interrupted periodically by Marcus's need to maintain their fire and monitor weather conditions. But as dawn approached, both Savannah and Marcus began focusing on practical planning for their evacuation from the mountains. The storm had left nearly 3 feet of fresh snow, making travel difficult, but not impossible for someone with Marcus's skills and equipment. More importantly, the weather was clearing, which meant that helicopter rescue might be feasible within the next day or two. But Marcus was reluctant to rely on modern rescue services if alternatives existed. His experience with wilderness emergencies had taught him that self-reliance was often safer than waiting for help that might be delayed by weather, equipment failures, or bureaucratic complications. "Can you travel?" he asked Savannah, assessing her physical condition with the clinical eye of someone trained in wilderness medicine. Savannah tested her strength and mobility, surprised to discover that a night of warmth, rest, and proper hydration had restored much of her energy. Her feet were tender from frostbite, and she had numerous cuts and bruises from her avalanche ordeal, but nothing that would prevent her from hiking out if necessary. "I think so," she said. "How far is it to safety?" Marcus was studying topographical maps, comparing modern cartography with traditional route knowledge that had been passed down through generations of indigenous travelers. "Several different options," he said. "Shortest distance is about 8 miles to a logging road where we could get cell phone coverage, but that route crosses avalanche terrain that's still unstable. Safer route is 12 miles, but it follows traditional hunting trails that avoid slide zones." The decision involved balancing speed against safety, but both of them understood that conservative choices were usually better in wilderness situations. They would take the longer route, moving carefully and resting frequently to avoid the kind of fatigue that led to poor decisions and dangerous mistakes. As they prepared to break camp, Savannah realized that she was about to leave behind the shelter that had saved her life, probably never to see it again. The structure that Marcus had built represented hours of skilled labor and intimate knowledge of survival techniques, but he was dismantling it as casually as if it were a tent from a sporting goods store. "Doesn't it bother you to destroy something you worked so hard to create?" she asked. Marcus paused in his packing to consider her question. "Traditional shelters are meant to be temporary, taking only what you need, leaving no trace, moving in harmony with natural cycles. That's how indigenous people lived sustainably for thousands of years." The philosophy represented a fundamental difference from modern approaches to land use, and it gave Savannah new perspective on conservation. Challenges she'd struggled with throughout her career. Instead of trying to preserve wilderness by excluding human activity, traditional cultures had developed ways of living that enhanced rather than degraded natural systems. As they began their trek out of the mountains, following game trails that were invisible to untrained eyes, Savannah realized that she was participating in something that few modern people ever experienced. She was traveling through wilderness using traditional knowledge, guided by someone whose understanding of the landscape had been developed and tested over generations. The education was just beginning. Over the next 12 miles, Marcus would teach her to read weather signs, identify edible plants, navigate by natural landmarks, and move through difficult terrain with minimal environmental impact. But more importantly, he would demonstrate a way of thinking about the relationship between humans and nature that could transform her approach to conservation work. The wolf den that had sheltered Savannah from death was behind them now, but the knowledge she was gaining from Marcus would stay with her for the rest of her life. She was discovering that survival wasn't just about individual skills or equipment. It was about understanding connections that linked all living things in patterns too complex for any single person to fully comprehend. As they disappeared into the forest, following trails that had been used by indigenous hunters for thousands of years, Savannah and Marcus were beginning a partnership that would bridge two worlds and change both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The trail Marcus Choctaw chose for their escape from the mountains was older than recorded history, carved by countless generations of elk, deer, and the indigenous hunters who had followed them through these valleys for over 8,000 years. As dawn broke through the clearing storm clouds, Savannah Mackenzie found herself walking in footsteps that connected her to an ancient relationship between humans and wilderness that predated everything she thought she knew about conservation. Marcus moved through the deep snow with an efficiency that seemed to defy physics. He wasn't wearing snowshoes, yet somehow he managed to stay on top of the powder, while Savannah, even with the traditional snowshoes he'd crafted for her during their shelter time, still broke through with every step. Watching him navigate the terrain, she began to understand that traditional travel wasn't just about equipment or physical conditioning. It was about reading micro-variations in snow density, understanding how wind patterns affected surface conditions, and choosing each footstep based on knowledge that most people never acquired. "How are you not sinking?" Savannah asked after struggling through a particularly deep drift, while Marcus seemed to glide across the same surface. Marcus paused to demonstrate, showing her how he distributed his weight differently, how he read the subtle color variations that indicated harder-packed snow, and how he used his walking stick not just for balance, but as a probe to test surface conditions before committing his full weight. "Snow isn't uniform," he explained. "Wind creates layers with different densities. Animals pack down certain areas while avoiding others. Traditional travelers learned to read these patterns because their lives depended on efficient movement." The Lesson was typical of what Savannah was discovering about Marcus's knowledge. Every technique had multiple layers of sophistication that weren't immediately obvious. What looked like simple woodcraft was actually applied physics, ecology, and psychology integrated into practical survival skills. Tracker, the wolf-husky mix, served as their advanced scout, ranging ahead to check trail conditions and alert them to potential hazards. But the dog's most valuable contribution was his ability to detect wildlife presence long before humans could see or hear anything. His behavioral changes provided Marcus with a constant stream of information about what animals were in the area, where they were moving, and whether they represented opportunities or threats. 2 hours into their trek, Tracker's alert posture indicated something significant ahead of them on the trail. Marcus immediately signaled for silence, then moved forward with the kind of stealth that seemed to make him nearly invisible despite his size. When he returned, his expression was serious. "Mountain lion," he said quietly. "Big male, probably. Following the same elk herd we heard last night. He's not hunting us, but he's curious about our scent." The news should have been terrifying, but Marcus's calm confidence was reassuring. He explained that mountain lions rarely attacked humans unless they were cornered, protecting cubs or suffering from disease or injury. More importantly, traditional knowledge included techniques for sharing territory with large predators without triggering aggressive encounters. "We'll take a detour," Marcus said, consulting both his topographical maps and mental knowledge of alternative routes. "Give him space to continue his hunt without interference." The detour added 2 miles to their journey, but it took them through terrain that provided Savannah with insights into traditional land management that challenged everything she'd learned about wilderness conservation. Marcus pointed out evidence of controlled burns that indigenous people had used to maintain forest health, natural clearings that had been enhanced through selective harvesting to create wildlife habitat, stream modifications that improved salmon spawning while preventing erosion. Modern conservation tries to preserve wilderness by keeping it unchanged, Marcus explained, as they rested beside a beaver pond that showed signs of traditional management. Traditional approaches recognized that humans could improve natural systems through careful intervention. The beaver pond was a perfect example. Instead of simply protecting the existing wetland, indigenous people had modified the dam structure to create deeper pools that supported more diverse fish populations. They'd selectively harvested certain tree species to encourage growth of plants that provided better food for waterfowl. The result was an ecosystem that was more productive and diverse than it would have been without human involvement. Savannah's scientific training made her skeptical of claims about traditional ecological management, but the evidence was undeniable. Soil samples would show higher nutrient levels. Biodiversity surveys would document more species than in comparable, untouched areas. Traditional knowledge had produced measurable improvements in ecosystem health. Why don't modern conservationists use these techniques? She asked. Marcus's expression suggested the question touched on frustrations he'd experienced throughout his career as a cultural educator. Because admitting that indigenous people improved natural systems would require acknowledging that current conservation approaches aren't optimal. It's easier to maintain the myth of pristine wilderness than to learn from traditional knowledge. The conversation continued as they made their way through increasingly familiar terrain. Marcus was navigating toward a seasonal hunting camp that his grandfather had established decades earlier, a location that would provide shelter and supplies for the final leg of their journey to safety. But as they traveled, Savannah began to understand that this wasn't just a wilderness evacuation. Marcus was providing her with an intensive education in traditional ecological knowledge that could transform her approach to wildlife veterinary work. Every plant they passed had multiple uses: food, medicine, tool-making materials or habitat. Enhancement. Every animal sign told a story about population health, territorial boundaries, and seasonal movement patterns. Every landscape feature served multiple functions in maintaining ecosystem balance. The traditional hunting camp was hidden in a grove of old-growth cedar that provided natural camouflage and weather protection. Marcus had been maintaining the site for 20 years, but following traditional protocols that left minimal environmental impact. The shelter structures were built from locally harvested materials and designed to blend into the natural landscape. Food caches were protected from wildlife using techniques that didn't require modern hardware or synthetic materials. As Marcus checked the camp's supply stores, Savannah explored the area with growing amazement. Everything about the site demonstrated sophisticated understanding of ecology, engineering, and resource management. Water sources had been enhanced without damaging stream flow. Waste disposal systems used natural processes to eliminate environmental contamination. Even the trail approaches were designed to minimize soil erosion and wildlife disturbance. "This is incredible," Savannah said, examining a food preservation system that used controlled airflow and temperature regulation to keep supplies fresh without refrigeration. "How long has this camp been here?" "My grandfather established this location in 1962, Marcus replied. "But indigenous people have been using this valley for seasonal hunting for probably 3,000 years. Archaeological evidence suggests multiple occupation periods going back to the earliest human presence in the Pacific Northwest." The historical continuity was overwhelming. Savannah was standing in a place where countless generations of skilled hunters had lived, worked, and passed on their knowledge to their children. The techniques Marcus was demonstrating weren't just individual survival skills. They were cultural traditions that connected him to thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. As they prepared to leave the hunting camp for the final approach to modern civilization, Marcus made a discovery that changed the entire nature of their journey. Hidden among his grandfather's supplies was a hand-drawn map that showed a network of traditional routes connecting this location to tribal communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. The map revealed that what Savannah had thought of as wilderness was actually a complex transportation network that indigenous people had used for trade, seasonal migration, and cultural exchange. Trails that looked like random game paths were actually carefully engineered highways that connected resource areas, spiritual sites, and permanent settlements across hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain. "This changes everything," Marcus said, studying the map with excitement that Savannah had never seen him display. "My grandfather never told me about these connections. He must have thought the traditional route system was too dangerous to share." The map showed that their current location was only a day's travel from a traditional salmon fishing station that connected to river routes extending all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Instead of hiking to the nearest logging road and calling for modern rescue, they could follow indigenous travel routes that would take them directly to Marcus's home community near the Chehalis River. "Are you suggesting we complete this journey using traditional methods?" Savannah asked, uncertain whether the idea was brilliant or insane. Marcus was clearly torn between practical safety considerations and an opportunity that might never come again. The traditional route would take 3 days instead of 1, and would require traveling through terrain that most people would consider impassable. But it would also allow them to complete their wilderness experience using knowledge and techniques that few modern people ever encountered. "It's your choice," Marcus said. "I can get you to safety by tonight using modern routes, or we can take the long way home and finish what we started." The decision required Savannah to evaluate everything she'd learned about herself during the past 48 hours. The avalanche had stripped away her illusions about self-sufficiency and forced her to rely on traditional knowledge that she'd never respected. The shelter experience had shown her that indigenous techniques were often superior to modern alternatives. The trail lessons had demonstrated that her scientific training was incomplete without understanding traditional ecological relationships. "I want to see where this goes," she said, surprised by her own certainty. "But I have conditions. I want to learn everything you're willing to teach me. And when we get back to civilization, I want to discuss how traditional knowledge could be integrated into modern conservation programs." Marcus's smile suggested that her answer had exceeded his expectations. "Then we continue the old way. But understand that this isn't going to be a casual hike. Traditional travel requires discipline, endurance, and constant attention to safety. In protocols, one mistake in this terrain could be fatal. The warning was serious, but Savannah had already committed herself to seeing this journey through to its conclusion. She'd survived an avalanche, escaped from an underground cave system, and learned more about wilderness survival in 2 days than she'd gained from years of academic study. Completing the journey using traditional methods would give her knowledge that no modern education could provide. As they prepared to leave the hunting camp, Marcus performed a brief ceremony that honored his grandfather's memory and asked for safe passage on the traditional routes they were about to follow. The ritual was simple but profound, acknowledging their connection to the generations of travelers who had used these paths before them. Tracker seemed to understand that their journey was entering a new phase. The dog's behavior became more focused, more alert, as if he recognized that they were no longer just surviving an emergency, but participating in something that connected them to ancient patterns of seasonal movement and cultural exchange. The trail that led away from the hunting camp was barely visible, marked by subtle signs that only someone trained in traditional navigation could recognize. Stone cairns that looked like natural rock formations, tree blazes so old they'd been nearly healed over by bark growth, changes in vegetation patterns that indicated human travel routes established over centuries of use. As they began following these ancient pathways, Savannah realized that she was participating in something that few modern people ever experienced. She was traveling through wilderness, using knowledge that predated European contact with North America, guided by someone whose cultural traditions connected him directly to the first people who had learned to live in harmony with this landscape. The education was far from over. Over the next 3 days, Marcus would teach her to navigate by star patterns, identify weather changes by observing animal behavior, and understand seasonal cycles that governed everything from plant growth to predator movements. But more importantly, he would demonstrate a way of thinking about human relationships with natural systems that could transform modern approaches to conservation. The traditional route they were following would take them through terrain that most people never saw, past sacred sites that weren't marked on any modern map, and into communities where traditional knowledge was still practiced and preserved. Savannah was about to discover that indigenous culture wasn't just historical curiosity. It was living wisdom that offered practical solutions to contemporary environmental challenges. As they disappeared into the forest, following trails that connected them to thousands of years of human experience in these mountains, Savannah and Marcus were beginning a partnership that would bridge 2 worlds and create new possibilities for understanding the relationship between humans and wilderness. The wolf den that had sheltered Savannah from death was now miles behind them, but the knowledge she was gaining from Marcus would influence every aspect of her future work as a wildlife veterinarian. She was discovering that traditional ecological knowledge wasn't just about survival techniques or historical interest. It was about understanding connections that linked all living things in patterns that could inform modern conservation efforts. The journey home was just beginning, but it was already clear that neither Savannah nor Marcus would ever see the world in quite the same way again. They were creating something new by combining traditional wisdom with modern expertise, building bridges between cultures that had been separated for too long by misunderstanding and institutional barriers. The mountains that had nearly killed Savannah were now teaching her lessons that would transform her life. And Marcus, who had spent years trying to share traditional knowledge with people who saw it as historical curiosity, had found someone who understood that indigenous wisdom offered practical solutions to contemporary challenges. Together, they were walking into a future that honored the past while creating new possibilities for human relationships with the natural world. The salmon fishing station that Marcus's grandfather's map had led them to was nothing like what Savannah Mackenzie had expected. Hidden in a bend of the Chehalis River, where ancient cedar trees formed a natural cathedral, the site looked unremarkable to untrained eyes, just weathered wooden platforms extending over dark water, with stone-lined fire pits and simple drying. Racks that could have been abandoned fishing equipment, but as Marcus Choctaw explained the sophisticated engineering and cultural significance of what she was seeing, Savannah realized she was standing in one of the most important archaeological sites in the Pacific Northwest. This fishing station has been in continuous use for over 4,000 years, Marcus said, running his hand along wooden posts that showed the careful joinery of traditional construction methods. Carbon dating on the oldest fish trap foundations shows that indigenous people were managing salmon runs here when the pyramids were being built in Egypt. The revelation was staggering. Savannah's scientific training had taught her to think of wilderness as pristine nature, unmarked by human activity. But everywhere Marcus looked, he saw evidence of sophisticated resource management that had sustained large populations for millennia. The fishing platforms were positioned to take advantage of natural current patterns that concentrated salmon in narrow channels. Stone weirs directed fish toward trap systems that allowed selective harvesting, while ensuring adequate breeding populations returned to spawning grounds upstream. "How is this not protected as a historical site?" Savannah asked, examining tool marks on cedar posts that showed craftsmanship rivaling modern engineering. Marcus's expression darkened. "Because acknowledging the sophistication of indigenous technology would contradict the narrative that this continent was empty wilderness before European colonization. It's easier to ignore evidence than to rewrite history books." The fishing station served as their base camp for the next phase of their journey, but it also became a classroom where Marcus shared knowledge that most anthropologists never encountered. He demonstrated traditional fish processing techniques that preserved protein without refrigeration. He showed her how indigenous people had modified stream flow to enhance salmon habitat while creating reliable water sources for human communities. Most importantly, he explained the complex social and spiritual protocols that governed resource use to ensure sustainability across generations. The protocols were far more sophisticated than modern environmental regulations. Instead of simple harvest quotas or seasonal restrictions, traditional management integrated ecological knowledge with cultural practices that reinforced conservation behavior. Ceremonial requirements that honored salmon spirits, social obligations that distributed resources equitably throughout communities, spiritual beliefs that made overharvesting tantamount to cultural suicide. Modern conservation treats humans as separate from natural systems, Marcus explained, as they watched salmon moving through the ancient fish ladder system. Traditional approaches recognized that humans were part of the ecosystem, with responsibilities as well as privileges. As evening approached, Marcus began preparing for what he called a proper introduction to his community. The traditional route they'd been following connected to a network of tribal families who still practiced many of the old ways, and their arrival would require observance of protocols that Savannah had never encountered. These aren't tourist demonstrations or cultural performances, Marcus warned. You'll be meeting people for whom traditional knowledge is living culture, not historical curiosity. Respect is earned through behavior, not good intentions. The prospect was both exciting and intimidating. Savannah had spent her career working with wildlife, which was predictable compared to human social dynamics. Animals followed behavioral patterns that could be studied and understood. People, especially people from cultures different from her own, represented unknown territory where her professional expertise offered little guidance. Marcus spent the evening teaching Savannah basic protocols for interacting with tribal elders, explaining concepts of reciprocity, respect, and relationship that governed traditional social interactions. The lessons weren't just about politeness or cultural sensitivity. They were about understanding fundamentally different ways of thinking about knowledge, authority, and human relationships. In traditional cultures, knowledge belongs to the community, not to individuals, Marcus explained. Sharing what you've learned with me creates obligations and relationships that extend beyond our personal friendship. Are you prepared for that level of commitment? The question forced Savannah to consider implications she hadn't anticipated. Her plan to integrate traditional knowledge into modern conservation programs would require ongoing collaboration with indigenous communities, not just academic study of traditional techniques. She would be entering into relationships that involved responsibilities, expectations, and cultural protocols that she barely understood. I think so, she said, though uncertainty colored her voice. But I need to learn more about what those obligations would involve, Marcus nodded approvingly. That's the right answer. Traditional knowledge isn't something you can take and use independently. It requires relationship, respect, and reciprocity. My grandfather used to say that knowledge without responsibility is just information. The next morning brought their first encounter with what Marcus called the extended family, a network of tribal members who maintained traditional practices while navigating the complexities of modern life. The meeting took place at a traditional longhouse that served as a community center for cultural activities, elder care, and informal education. Savannah was introduced to Joseph Bearcloud, an 86-year-old medicine man who had known Marcus's grandfather and served as keeper of traditional ecological knowledge for the regional tribal council. Joseph's weathered hands and sharp eyes suggested someone who had spent decades observing natural systems with the kind of attention that most people reserve for microscopes and computer screens. Marcus tells me you survived an avalanche, Joseph said, studying Savannah with interest that felt like a gentle but thorough examination. And that you learned some things about traditional ways during your rescue. The conversation that followed was unlike any professional interview Savannah had ever experienced. Joseph didn't ask about her credentials, her research experience, or her career accomplishments. Instead, he wanted to know about her relationship with the land, her understanding of reciprocity, and her willingness to learn from sources that weren't validated by academic institutions. Modern education teaches people to think they can understand nature by studying it from the outside, Joseph said. Traditional knowledge requires recognizing that humans are part of the systems we're trying to understand. The observer affects the observed, as your quantum physicists are finally discovering. The philosophical depth of the conversation challenged Savannah's assumptions about indigenous knowledge. She'd expected folklore and practical techniques, not sophisticated discussions of systems thinking and ecological relationships that paralleled cutting-edge scientific research. Joseph introduced her to other community members who specialized in different aspects of traditional knowledge. Maria So Happy, a plant specialist who maintained seed stocks for native species that had nearly disappeared from the region. Thomas Kiona, a traditional hunter who monitored wildlife populations using observation techniques that provided data comparable to modern biological surveys. Sarah Culty, a traditional healer who used medicinal plants in ways that pharmaceutical companies were trying to understand and replicate. Each specialist represented decades of accumulated knowledge that had been tested through practical application across generations. Their expertise wasn't theoretical. It was based on direct observation, experimentation, and refinement of techniques that had been proven to work in real-world conditions. "This is incredible," Savannah told Marcus as they toured a traditional plant propagation facility where native species were being cultivated for habitat restoration projects. "These people have knowledge that could revolutionize modern conservation efforts." Marcus smiled at her enthusiasm but tempered it with realism. "They've been trying to share this knowledge with government agencies and universities for decades. The problem isn't lack of information, it's institutional resistance to learning from sources that don't fit academic credentialing systems." The challenge was familiar from Savannah's own professional experience. Scientific institutions valued peer-reviewed research over traditional knowledge, even when traditional approaches produced better results. Academic careers were built on publishing original research, not on learning from indigenous elders who had been studying ecological systems for longer than most university programs had existed. But as Savannah spent more time with the community, she began to see possibilities for collaboration that could benefit both traditional knowledge keepers and modern conservation organizations. Her veterinary credentials could provide legitimacy for traditional approaches to wildlife management. Her access to academic and government networks could create platforms for traditional knowledge that hadn't existed before. The breakthrough came during a community meeting where tribal members were discussing problems with wildlife management on traditional territories. State and federal agencies were implementing conservation strategies that conflicted with traditional practices, creating conflicts between indigenous communities and government regulators. "They want to protect salmon by restricting our fishing rights," complained Robert Culty, a traditional fisherman whose family had been managing salmon runs for 7 generations. "But their regulations don't account for traditional management, practices that have maintained healthy fish populations for thousands of years." Savannah found herself in the unexpected position of serving as translator between traditional knowledge and scientific terminology. Her veterinary training allowed her to understand the biological principles underlying traditional management practices. Her academic credentials gave her credibility with government agencies that dismissed indigenous knowledge as unscientific. "What if we documented traditional practices using scientific methodology?" she suggested. "Collected data that proved traditional management produces better conservation outcomes than current regulations." The proposal generated intense discussion. Some community members were skeptical of subjecting traditional knowledge to scientific validation, arguing that indigenous approaches didn't need approval from outside institutions. Others saw potential benefits in having scientific documentation that could support treaty rights and traditional resource management claims. Joseph Bearcloud, the medicine man whose opinion carried significant weight in community decisions, supported the collaboration with conditions that revealed the sophistication of traditional thinking about knowledge sharing. "Traditional knowledge belongs to the community," he said. "Any research partnership must recognize tribal sovereignty over information that comes from our territories and our practices. Dr. Mackenzie would be learning from us, not studying us." The distinction was crucial. Traditional academic research typically treated indigenous people as subjects to be studied by outside experts. Joseph was proposing a partnership where tribal communities maintained control over their knowledge while collaborating with sympathetic professionals who could help translate traditional approaches into forms that modern institutions would accept. Over the following days, Savannah participated in traditional resource management activities that provided her with direct experience of indigenous conservation practices. She joined salmon monitoring surveys that used traditional observation techniques alongside modern counting methods. She participated in controlled burns that demonstrated traditional forest management approaches. She learned traditional veterinary techniques for treating wildlife injuries using medicinal plants and natural therapies. Each activity reinforced her growing understanding that traditional knowledge wasn't primitive or outdated. It was sophisticated technology that had been developed and refined over thousands of years by people whose survival depended on accurate understanding of natural systems. The collaboration also revealed the personal transformation that Savannah had undergone since her Avalanche experience. The isolated wildlife veterinarian who had sought solitude in the mountains was being replaced by someone who understood that meaningful conservation work required community engagement and cultural humility. Marcus observed the changes with satisfaction that extended beyond successful rescue. His grandfather had taught him that traditional knowledge was meant to be shared with people who would use it responsibly, but finding such people was rare. Savannah's willingness to learn, her respect for traditional protocols, and her professional skills made her an ideal bridge between indigenous knowledge and mainstream conservation. "You're not the same person who was tracking that injured wolf," Marcus told her as they prepared to leave the tribal community for the final leg of their journey back to modern civilization. Savannah considered the observation, recognizing its truth. The avalanche had stripped away more than her equipment and safety margins. It had forced her to abandon assumptions about self-sufficiency, cultural superiority, and the sources of real knowledge. She'd learned that survival required community, that traditional knowledge often surpassed modern alternatives, and that meaningful conservation work demanded humility and collaboration. "I hope I'm not," she replied. "The person who went into those mountains was running away from human relationships. I think the person leaving is ready to build new ones." The return to her cabin near Cascade Falls took them through familiar territory that looked completely different after her week-long immersion in traditional knowledge. Landscapes she'd seen as wilderness were now visible as managed ecosystems shaped by thousands of years of indigenous stewardship. Plants she'd ignored were now recognizable as food sources, medicines, and habitat enhancement tools. Animal signs she'd missed were now readable as stories about population health, territorial boundaries, and seasonal movement patterns. But the most significant change was in Savannah's understanding of her professional role as a wildlife veterinarian. Instead of seeing herself as a defender of nature against human encroachment, she was beginning to envision work that helped humans and wildlife coexist in relationships that benefited both species. The collaboration with Marcus's tribal community would continue through formal partnerships that documented traditional knowledge while respecting indigenous intellectual property rights. Research projects that validated traditional management practices using scientific methodology. Educational programs that taught conservation professionals to integrate traditional approaches with modern techniques. As they reached Savannah's cabin, where her abandoned jeep sat under a week's accumulation of snow, both she and Marcus understood that their wilderness rescue had evolved into something much larger than emergency survival. They had created a partnership that bridged cultures, combined different ways of knowing, and opened possibilities for conservation work that honored both traditional wisdom and modern scientific understanding. The wolf den that had sheltered Savannah from the Avalanche was now part of a larger story about the connections between predator and prey, survival and community, ancient knowledge and contemporary challenges. She had gone into the mountains to save an injured wolf and had ended up discovering relationships that would transform her life and work in ways she was only beginning to understand. Marcus had found something equally valuable, a colleague who understood that traditional knowledge offered practical solutions to modern problems, someone whose professional credentials could help traditional approaches gain recognition in mainstream conservation institutions. Together, they were embarking on work that could help heal the artificial separation between humans and nature that had created many of the environmental challenges facing the contemporary world. The ancient paths they had followed out of the mountains were leading toward new beginnings that honored the past, while creating possibilities for a more sustainable future. The small town of Cascade Falls looked exactly the same as when Savannah. Mackenzie had left it 8 days earlier to track an injured wolf, but everything felt profoundly different as she and Marcus Chitto drove down the familiar main street in her rescued Jeep. The single traffic light, the weathered storefronts, the residents bundled against the March cold, all were unchanged, yet Savannah felt like she was seeing civilization through completely new eyes. Word of her disappearance had spread through the tight-knit mountain community with the speed that characterized small towns where everyone knew their neighbor's business. Jake Morrison, the rancher who had originally called her about the wolf attack, was waiting at her veterinary clinic with a mixture of relief and curiosity that bordered on desperation. "Doc Mackenzie," Jake called as they pulled up. "Thank God. You're alive. We had search teams combing those mountains for 3 days before the weather shut everything down. Where the hell have you been?" The question should have been simple to answer, but Savannah found herself struggling to explain an experience that seemed to belong to a different world from the one she was now entering. How could she describe surviving an avalanche, sheltering in a wolf den, and learning traditional knowledge that had transformed her understanding of wilderness and conservation? "I got caught in that avalanche on Cascade Ridge," she said carefully. "Marcus found me and helped me get out safely." The explanation was technically accurate, but completely inadequate for conveying what had actually happened. Jake's weathered face showed confusion as he looked between Savannah and Marcus, clearly trying to understand how a Choctaw tracker had been in the mountains at exactly the right time and place to execute what appeared to be an impossible rescue. 8 days, Jake muttered. "You've been missing for 8 days. The sheriff called off the search after the second storm moved in, said no one could survive that long in those conditions." Marcus remained quiet, understanding that Savannah needed to navigate this re-entry into her normal life without the complications that would arise from describing their traditional route home or the time they'd spent with the tribal community. The modern world operated according to different rules and expectations, and their week-long journey through indigenous cultural territory would raise questions that might undermine the partnerships they were planning to build. But even the simplified version of events was generating more attention than Savannah had anticipated. Within an hour of their arrival, her clinic was filled with neighbors, local officials, and curious residents who wanted to hear the story of her miraculous survival. Each retelling forced her to edit out more details, reducing an experience that had fundamentally changed her worldview into an adventure story suitable for casual conversation. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Savannah's colleague from the Pacific Northwest Wildlife Center, arrived with medical supplies and professional concern. "You need a full medical evaluation," she insisted, studying Savannah's weathered appearance with clinical attention. "Hypothermia, frostbite, dehydration, you could have serious injuries that aren't immediately apparent." The medical examination that followed was thorough, but also surreal. Elizabeth documented minor frostbite on Savannah's fingers and toes, multiple contusions from her avalanche experience, and signs of significant weight loss from 8 days of survival conditions. But she couldn't document the more profound changes that Savannah was experiencing, the shift in perspective that made her see human relationships with natural systems in completely new ways. "You're remarkably healthy considering what you've been through," Elizabeth concluded, "but I want you to take at least a week off from work. Trauma responses can be delayed, and you need time to process this experience." The suggestion was sensible but frustrating. Savannah was eager to begin implementing the ideas that had emerged from her collaboration with Marcus and the tribal community, but she also recognized that jumping immediately into ambitious conservation projects might seem impulsive to colleagues who didn't understand the context of her transformation. Marcus, meanwhile, was preparing to return to his own community and responsibilities. His role as a cultural educator required him to document their rescue experience for tribal elders who tracked traditional knowledge applications in contemporary contexts. But he was also planning the formal research partnerships that would allow their collaboration to continue. "This isn't the end," he assured Savannah as they discussed their next steps. "Traditional relationships take time to develop properly. We'll build the partnership slowly, with respect for both scientific protocols and indigenous knowledge-sharing customs." The plan they developed over the following days was ambitious but carefully structured. They would begin with small-scale demonstration projects that validated traditional management techniques using scientific methodology. Document traditional veterinary practices for treating wildlife injuries. Develop educational programs that taught conservation professionals to integrate indigenous knowledge with modern approaches. But the most immediate challenge was convincing institutional gatekeepers that traditional knowledge deserved serious consideration. Savannah's supervisor at the Wildlife Center, Dr. Robert Sterling, was skeptical when she proposed incorporating indigenous techniques into their treatment protocols. These traditional methods might be interesting from an anthropological perspective, Sterling said during their first meeting after her return. "But our veterinary practices are based on peer-reviewed science, not folklore and cultural traditions." The dismissive response was exactly what Marcus had warned her to expect. Modern institutions were structured to validate knowledge through academic credentials and published research, not through the generational testing and practical application that characterized traditional approaches. But Savannah had advantages that most advocates for traditional knowledge lacked. Her veterinary credentials provided institutional legitimacy. Her recent survival experience gave her personal testimony about the effectiveness of traditional techniques, and her documented rescue by Marcus demonstrated the practical value of indigenous knowledge in life or death situations. What if we could prove that traditional methods produce better outcomes than current protocols? Savannah proposed. Design controlled studies that test traditional approaches against standard treatments. The research proposal intrigued Sterling despite his initial skepticism. The Wildlife Center was always looking for innovative approaches to challenging cases, and Savannah's professional reputation gave weight to her suggestions. Over the following weeks, Savannah began designing research protocols that could validate traditional veterinary techniques using scientific methodology. Working with Marcus and tribal healers, she identified specific treatments that could be tested in controlled environments. Herbal remedies for inflammatory conditions, traditional wound care techniques, behavioral modification approaches based on indigenous understanding of animal psychology. The work required delicate negotiation between scientific requirements and traditional knowledge-sharing protocols. Tribal communities were willing to collaborate, but they insisted on maintaining control over their intellectual property and ensuring that any research benefits were shared equitably. Joseph Bearcloud, the tribal elder who had become one of Savannah's most important teachers, provided guidance for navigating these complex relationships. "Traditional knowledge belongs to the people," he reminded her during one of their planning meetings. "Any research must serve our communities, not just academic institutions." The principle required Savannah to reconsider her entire approach to conservation work. Instead of extracting traditional knowledge for use in mainstream programs, she was learning to build partnerships that recognized indigenous sovereignty while creating platforms for traditional approaches to gain broader recognition. The first breakthrough came when a young wolf with severe injuries was brought to the Wildlife Center after being struck by a vehicle. Standard treatment protocols called for extensive surgery and weeks of rehabilitation, but traditional healers suggested alternative approaches that might be less traumatic for the animal. Working with Maria Sohapi, the tribal plant specialist, Savannah developed a treatment plan that combined modern veterinary surgery with traditional healing techniques. The wolf received necessary medical intervention, but its recovery was supported by herbal treatments, traditional nutritional approaches, and behavioral modification techniques based on indigenous understanding of wolf psychology. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The wolf healed faster than predicted, showed less stress during treatment, and demonstrated behavioral adaptations that suggested more complete recovery than typical for similar injuries. Most importantly, the collaborative approach created documentation that validated traditional knowledge using scientific standards. "This could change everything," Elizabeth Chen observed as they reviewed the treatment data. "If traditional methods consistently produce better outcomes, we'll need to reconsider our entire approach to wildlife rehabilitation." The success of the wolf treatment project provided a foundation for expanding the collaboration between the Wildlife Center and tribal communities. Other conservation organizations began expressing interest in incorporating traditional knowledge into their programs. Academic institutions started developing formal partnerships with indigenous communities for research and education. But the most significant change was in Savannah's personal understanding of her role as a wildlife veterinarian. The isolated professional who had sought solitude in the mountains was being replaced by someone who understood that meaningful conservation work required community engagement, cultural humility, and recognition that indigenous knowledge offered sophisticated solutions to contemporary environmental challenges. 6 months after her Avalanche rescue, Savannah stood in the same mountains where Marcus had found her, but this time she was leading a training program for conservation professionals who wanted to learn traditional ecological knowledge. The program brought together wildlife biologists, forest managers, and tribal educators for intensive field experiences that demonstrated indigenous approaches to land management and wildlife conservation. The injured wolf that had originally drawn her into the mountains had recovered completely and been successfully released back into its pack territory. But more importantly, the traditional knowledge that had saved Savannah's life was now being shared with a new generation of conservation professionals who understood that indigenous wisdom offered practical solutions to modern environmental challenges. Marcus, who had become her closest collaborator and trusted friend, served as lead instructor for the traditional knowledge components of the training program. Their partnership had evolved into something that transcended professional cooperation. They had become bridges between worlds that had been separated for too long by institutional barriers and cultural misunderstanding. "My grandfather would be proud," Marcus said, as they watched program participants learning to read landscape signs and understand ecological relationships through traditional methods. He always believed that traditional knowledge was meant to be shared with people who would use it to help the land and all its creatures. The avalanche that had nearly killed Savannah had instead led to discoveries that were transforming conservation. Work throughout the Pacific Northwest, traditional knowledge was being validated through scientific research. Indigenous communities were gaining recognition for their sophisticated understanding of ecological systems. And new partnerships were emerging that honored both traditional wisdom and modern expertise. But perhaps most importantly, Savannah had learned that survival wasn't just about individual skills or equipment. It was about understanding connections that linked all living things in patterns too complex for any single person to fully comprehend. The wolf den that had sheltered her from death had become a symbol of the shelter that communities could provide for each other when they chose cooperation over isolation. As the training program participants prepared to return to their agencies and organizations, carrying traditional knowledge that would influence conservation decisions for years to come, Savannah understood that her rescue from the mountains had been just the beginning of a larger journey toward healing the artificial separation between humans and nature that had created many of the environmental challenges facing the contemporary world. The ancient paths that Marcus had shown her weren't just routes through wilderness. They were ways of thinking that could guide modern society toward more sustainable relationships with the natural world. And the partnership she had built with indigenous communities wasn't just about improving wildlife management. It was about creating new possibilities for all people to live in harmony with the land that sustained them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.